This is the Demographics Decoded Podcast with me, demographer Simon Kuestenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, property and wealth creation expert. And this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping our futures. Now, today I want to discuss a topic that just won't stay out of the news this year, being a federal election coming up. House prices. So whether you're climbing to new heights or you're getting into the property market, the ripple effect of the property market seems to affect all of us, whether we're owners or tenants. But the question I want to discuss with you today, Simon, is when house prices go up, as they have, when they're reaching new highs as they have, are there more winners and losers? Now, I know you wrote an article about this in The Australian a while ago. So.
Exactly, and it is a absolutely crucial topic to understand who benefits from certain policy developments and who suffers, because then you can at least guess a bit more where future policy might be going, which is important when you make your investment decisions and when you want to feel safe and secure about your investments.
At the end of last year, the housing market finished 2024 about 8% higher than the year started. Very fragmented markets. Perth, Adelaide, Brisbane had double-digit growth. Sydney did well. Melbourne really floundered, as did Canberra and Hobart. But there are a whole group of stakeholders in the property market, Simon. 2/3 of Australians live in a home, their home. Some of them have got mortgage, some of them haven't. And then there's about 2.3 million Australians who also own investment properties. And if you look at all the various stakeholders, Simon, the banks, I guess they're getting wealthier if people buy properties, property developers, state governments. Everybody seems to have an interest in property values rising.
Exactly. So we have an ecosystem that developed around the expectations of a property market growing. And if you look back over the last, let's call it 50, 60 years even, most people that had their finger in the property pie, they've done well. Things went their way. And this could be anyone who took part in any kind of property transaction. These are the mortgage brokers, the lenders, whatever it is. There is so much stuff, the auctioneers that comes to mind. So that's a positive development. We got used to this. The idea of
Simon, if I could interrupt, also the governments. So while tenants are having some trouble and first home buyers are having some trouble, the governments are grabbing bucketfuls of money along the way, aren't they?
Oh, exactly. We created a system where state governments in particular very much got hooked on fees that occurred during a property transaction, stamp duty. So why would you take this fee away from you? So you're very, very unmotivated to be doing this. Even if you were to think, maybe it's fairer from a governmental perspective to say we charge a land tax rather than stamp duty. That from a cash flow perspective, especially for a broke state, and not looking at Victoria in particular here,
no one in
very
particular,
unattractive, because you get a trickle of income each month or quarter or year, however you charge it as a state government from a land tax. But the sugar hit of a nice stamp duty fee with every property transaction, it is just too good to forego. So the motivation is very low to do so.
Well, local governments also have their fingers in the pie or their hands in my pocket, don't they?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Fees are linked to the value of a property. So you create a system where overall, in purely numerical terms, more people are winning when property prices are high than are losing. You even see this in the language that is being used when you are reporting on property prices. It is usually being spoken about in a sense that high property prices, price growth is good, price falls are bad. That is the language. Per se, this is neither wrong nor right, it's neither good nor bad, it's just a squiggly line that goes up and down. But our mindset is very much attached to the idea that property prices are meant to go up because overall most people benefit from high house prices. And you before that mentioned the statistics that 2/3 of people in Australia live in a house that they own or have a mortgage on. That number even gets bigger when you completely ignore those people who are not voting. If you only look at voters, it is actually 3/4 of people, the voters, who live in a house that they own or rent. And in a sense, this is politically speaking the more important cohort.
Interesting. So clearly the governments have a vested interest. So if we're talking about who wins. In a moment we'll talk about who loses, but the topic I'd like to, discuss is the winners and losers with higher house prices. It's homeowners, the banks, but there's a whole lot of other industries as well, because the construction industry makes its money when prices go up because new construction occurs. And then there's a ripple effect from all that as well. Financial advisors, insurance companies, valuers, websites, lawyers. Looks like almost everyone wins when property values go up, Simon.
Yes, so we created a long list of people who win. Just in order to understand property developers, you could say, well, are they actually benefiting from high property prices? If properties were super cheap, wouldn't I just build more houses then? Wouldn't people then be willing? Could anyone then afford a house and I ultimately create more houses and that would be good as a developer? And you go, yeah, kind of understand this argument. But ultimately, property developers run a simple business. You build a box at whatever cost, and then you slap 15% or thereabouts on top. That is your profit margin. And so you go, yeah, ultimately though, if I can sell anything that I built anyways, it's much more fun to sell something for a higher price, because then the 15% is more lucrative for me. So they're not really incentivized to drive prices down as long as there are enough people paying for it.
Over this last year, there's been a lot of talk about affordability, and I'm sure as we move in through this new year, politicians are going to be talking about affordability, especially with an election coming up. But I do remember a quip from the old Prime Minister John Howard, who said he never met anyone who complained about the value of their house going up. And maybe that's created a few short-term policies when the housing affordability issue is really a long-term problem.
That's exactly the bit where I start to get scared about the fortunes of our two major parties, if you will. So the idea is quite simple, that if 3/4 of voters, and they tend to be the older voters, live in a house that they own or rent, then it's actually exactly 26% of renters, of the voters in Australia, they increasingly are becoming very, very critical of current housing policy, because they see that policies are not really interested in driving prices down, because there are too many people who win with high house prices. But what you can't do as a major party is to say, yeah, this is a high house price environment. If you can't afford a house, it's bad luck. We don't make policy for you. Screw you, essentially. That's what they are doing, but you can't say it. So what you then need to do is you need to come up with policies that look like they're tackling housing affordability, but they actually do the opposite. And this is what something like first home buyer grants are. First home buyer grants essentially say, here's $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, whatever it is, from the public coffers to a select number of first home buyers, and you then get to spend this on your first home. For this particular individual homeowner, this might be good policy, because you should always take free money that the government gives you. Rule of thumb. But ultimately, this is driving house prices up, because you are telling not just the first home buyers that there's money in the market, you're also telling the market. And the market then automatically adjusts for this additional cash, and that increases house prices. So a policy that looks like it is driving house prices down is actually driving it up. So it is a waste of public money.
Well, it's actually going to make it worse for the next generation, isn't it?
Exactly. So it kicks the bucket down the road. It's really that. It makes it even harder. And then you need to come up with yet another policy to kind of sort of make things work in the short term. And that would be the super for housing policy, where you say, take $50,000 of your superannuation, and the young people who are first home buyers, they won't even have $50,000 in there. They'll take all of their super. They disrupt compounding in their superannuation, and they then spend this on housing. And so they actually don't waste public money on driving up house prices. They make it even worse. They waste their own money on driving up house prices. And so that's a shame, these kind of policies. And we're seeing this in a wonderful data set that is called the Australian Election Survey. After every federal election, they run detailed surveys with voters, ask them, who did you vote for today? Who did you vote for last? And then they ask them heaps of questions about their values. And what we see in Australia today, and we kind of ignore it because we still run a two-party system where the preferential voting is a thing, and so it doesn't come to light immediately. But everyone under 40 essentially hates the two major parties. They have no what is called partisanship towards the parties. That means they don't really feel connected to either Labour or Liberal. They have no loyalty in their vote, meaning they're happily to switch votes from one party to the next from between elections. So that speaks very, very grim picture for the two major parties, because as you have more loyal partisan voters die on one end of the spectrum, you're now pushing more and more younger voters into the biggest voter cohort, and they hate the two major parties. This is great news, by the way, if you happen to be the Green Party, the Teal Party, if you happen to be Pauline Hanson, Jackie Lambie, whoever you are.
Gun lobby.
But that, of course, means that we are splintering the political system. That means that the balance of power increasingly in the future shifts towards the smaller third parties. And we see this right now. At the last election, almost a third, it's 31% of voters voted for a party other than Labour or Liberal in their first preference vote.
Really?
And so that is up from 2% at the 1987 election. It went up year by year. And this coming election, it will be the same.
That showed up at the end of last year, Simon, when in the last week of sitting of Parliament, when the Greens gave the green light, if I could use that expression, to a whole lot of policies. They held them up, but they held the balance of power, and Labor got through over 30 policies in the last couple of days because of the smaller party holding the balance.
Exactly. And you see there how hard it is to get policy through without the stamp of approval of a still relatively small vote. So even though these renters would be considered the losers of a high house price environment, they now have a rather radical at times political party having their back, because the Greens very much understand that you can, as an opposition power that doesn't have any real say, they don't need to take real responsibility, but they can negotiate strongly. And to me, there's no backing down of the Greens party in the future, so they will play this hardball third-party game. And I would say if you forecast policy into the future, this is something that I would take into account. I would say, yes, Labour or Liberal, whoever is in power, they will have their policies. They will want to get them through. They increasingly can't do this by themselves. So they need the third parties. And then you need to think, what do the third parties care about? And renters' rights and environmental stuff is what the Greens really push on. All the other stuff is kind of negotiable, to be honest. I think that's the two big pet projects. And we'll see if we like this, because increasingly, of course, more and more people rent that are not necessarily as left as the Greens. But if you want low housing costs, who do you vote for? And
well, let's look into who those could be. So we talked about all those people who at the moment would benefit from higher house prices. The list of people who would benefit from lower prices, I think, is much shorter, but I guess it's first home buyers, people wanting to get into the market, renters, they'd like properties to be as cheap as possible, probably a number of charities, as you were suggesting. I mean, there's always going to be disenfranchised people. There's always going to be need for social housing. The government isn't supplying that, but that's a totally different argument. So there isn't really that many people, different groups of people who would benefit from this, are there?
Exactly, not in numerical terms, in relative terms. From a voting perspective, you can still, I would say, for the next 10 to 15 years, safely ignore the concerns of people who struggle on the housing market. If you're purely interested in becoming the party in power. This is, of course, a cynical view of policy. I don't really think that we're just as cynical. But again, this sets more or less the direction in which we're going. And also, I would then think, what am I doing for those people, for those young, struggling people, for those renters? And we kind of found a roundabout way of tackling housing affordability at the moment without saying the difficult thing of, if you make housing more affordable, you need to make it cheaper. Because housing affordability is just the ratio between how much money do I have, my income, and how much do I spend on the house price. And so theoretically, if you double your income, all of a sudden housing becomes heaps more affordable. But we can't do this. This is wage inflation. We can't all earn so much more money year by year. So we need to essentially at some point freeze house price growth, slow it to a degree that we grow house prices at a lower rate than we increase wage growth, something like this. But we can't talk about it. The way that we can talk about it, politically speaking, is that we say it's all about supply, supply, supply. Because this way you get to talk about, we make more housing available, but we don't really say that this makes prices cheaper for everyone, even though it does. But
Yes.
it's a skewed roundabout way that we decided we're now tackling housing affordability for the first time. I've been here for 18 years now or something like this. And this is for the first time that I have been hearing real policy that could make housing more affordable, for better or worse. But this is a change. But of course, we have the problem, what did we decide to do in order to make housing more affordable? The first thing is that we changed zoning. We look at New South Wales, look at Victoria. We said, near the train stations, we'll make it very easy for you to build medium density, high density dwellings. This is great. We use the existing infrastructure. We build housing stock there. It's good stuff. From an urban planning perspective, it is 100% the right policy. No criticism against this from my end. But of course, there is the economic problem at the moment that building housing in Australia is about a third of the price per square meter on a greenfield site on the outskirts of town compared to a medium or high density dwelling at the center of town.
Yes.
Just the construction costs and tax and whatever. And so then you go, well, who can afford a family-sized dwelling, whatever it is, let's call it a 3-bedroom. I can buy a 3-bedroom apartment in a middle suburb, or I can buy a 3-bedroom house on the outskirts of town. The 3-bedroom apartment is much more expensive. So who can afford this? It's the fancy, cashed up dinks that don't have kids, double income, no kids, households that want to live close to the center of town. These are the wealthy downsizers, but it's not the medium and low income families that want to live reasonably close to their work. That doesn't make sense. So urban sprawl is almost guaranteed to continue despite having all the right housing policies, because we didn't make housing much cheaper to construct.
Interestingly, we've discussed the widening wealth gap in a number of previous episodes of Demographics Decoded. I want to ask you about that in a moment, but if somebody's listening to this or watching us on YouTube and they're finding this valuable information, please subscribe on whichever podcast app you're listening to this on, and do us a favour and tell somebody else about the Demographics Decoded show too, because Simon and my aim is to make as many people aware of the demographic trends that are going to be shaping their future. And this is one, it's really not as much demographics we're talking about today, but property prices are integral to the way we live in Australia. A bit different to in Europe, Simon, isn't it? But the wealth gap is widening. As I say, we've discussed this before, but the rising house prices, and the fact that some people are being helped by the bank of mum and dad, so wealth is remaining within families compared to others, that's creating a bit of the social unrest as well.
Exactly. And in the long term, they are not the majority at all, but more and more of the young people find themselves looking at the system as a whole with a widening wealth gap, where they go like, I might be earning just as much income as the other family. I might have done just as well in my education than this other family, but they have the bank of mom and dad and I don't. So
Yes.
They really feel that the whole system isn't working for them. That is a real danger, because if people think that the system isn't working for them, they start hating capitalism. They start hating democracy. And then they look at alternatives. And my reading of history is that the alternatives are less desirable than a reform of capitalism and democracy, so to speak. So it's a very difficult balance to strike, because you still want to become the party in power as any kind of party that makes housing policy. But you also need to make sure that you transition into this softly, because you can't create a house price crash. But you need to pull it down a bit to make sure that you have a fighting chance for young people to enter. But also, you then need to ensure that it still grows, because otherwise, why would you jump on a losing kind of battle? So it's actually a rather delicate problem to navigate.
And if I could interrupt, that's an interesting point, because all the young people don't want house prices to go up until they buy a house, and then all of a sudden, maybe interest rates will affect them a bit, but they want house prices to go up then, don't they?
Exactly, and that's the real difficult issue there, is how do you balance that? And particularly right now, the first home buyers of the next 10 years would be millennials. So they're part of a big cohort. And so if you screw over a big cohort as a Labour or Liberal Party, they will remember this and they will take this into account in their voting behavior in the future. A Labour or a Liberal Party afford to permanently lose the millennial vote or a big chunk of the millennial vote. I would say they can't. And as I'm reading the politics of Australia right now, they are losing them though, in a permanent sense. So, and I'm looking, of course, always at German politics as a bit of a reference of what might happen in the future. And if I look at the German Labour Party, they were easily used to win votes in the low 40s throughout the 80s and early 90s. They're a very popular party. They're now polling at 13, 14, 15%. You can completely politic yourself out of relevance. I'm not saying that Labour is doing that. I kind of am, but I'm definitely seeing this as a major risk. So I'm always hoping for an invitation to speak at the major Liberal or Labour Party conventions just to shock the right people into action.
Simon, we know that a lot of immigration is occurring because people are coming to Australia for a better life. They're looking for the safety, the security, the stability in our politics. But most immigrants also want to buy a home in Australia. Not straight away. They want to find out where they're going to live. Unaffordable housing discourage some of these skilled migrants and maybe allow them to choose other options like New Zealand or, well, I was going to say Canada, but Canada's got a worse problem than we have.
Yes, absolutely. So if you look at what migrants want, they tend to not wake up in the middle of Manila or New Delhi and go, I must go to Australia. That's not what they're doing. They actually go, I must move to an English-speaking country that offers me better economic opportunities and better financial stability and safety than my home country. And they then look at the big five: US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK. These are the preferred destinations, and they then consider where's it cheaper to move to, and where do I get cheaper housing, where do I get a better pathway to citizenship. That's what they're after. And so all of this gets fed into their decision making. They of course also look, where do I have relatives, and then they avoid those relatives and move elsewhere, or they move to those relatives depending on your family relations, I guess. But the idea there is, are we losing a competitive edge by making housing so expensive? And that's true to a degree, I would say. Of course, particularly if we look at low-income migrants. So some of these skilled migrants that we take in, they will be structural engineers, they will be medical experts, they will be IT specialists, mining workers. We will pay them good money. So ultimately, I'm not too worried about us finding housing for them. But we will also import a bucket load of nurses, a bucket load of aged care workers, and so forth. What are we doing for those workers? Because they will look at their relatively meager wages. They will still want to send certain amounts of this back as remittances. And they then look at house prices. And they look, this is a stupid deal. It just doesn't add up. You need to remember that migrants ultimately tend to be very pragmatic in their decisions. And we are losing a bit of competitive edge there. And I know it's always easy. It's the same discussion always that we say, we have too many migrants. We need fewer migrants. We discussed this in many episodes before. Yes. We will discuss it in future episodes. But it is my main reading that I would say, roughly speaking, we're taking in the right number of migrants, because we need to create strong population growth to soften the aging of Australia, to soften the prolonged skills shortage. We discussed this in previous podcasts. But do I think the migration system in Australia needs to be massively overhauled so that we have better control over who we let into the country and where do we position them in Australia? Absolutely. So these are two separate discussions, though.
Now, moving forward, I can't see a quick change to the affordability problems with housing, because we know the government's wanting us to build 1.2 million new dwellings. We also know that's not going to happen over the 5-year time frame they've got. But the ones that are financially viable at the moment are the more expensive properties. Developers can build apartments. As you say, they're much more expensive to build than houses, but they can build them for the right sizes, the downsizes, those baby boomers who've got equity in their home. But it's very difficult currently to build for in the affordable market. We know build to rent is going to provide accommodation, but even so, probably not as much affordable accommodation as we'd like. And I think the concept of rent controls has been taken off the table, even though the Greens would love to introduce that. So without an easy end in sight, Simon, how do you believe we can balance the winners and losers in the property market to ensure that there's stability, but also social equity?
Yeah, I think one of the issues would be a very, very honest political discussion from the two major parties that says we need to soften the price growth. We need to honestly, and they're doing this with saying we double down on building. It's a good approach because this ultimately does soften the house price growth, because if there are more buildings, there is less competition.
More supply and demand.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. And so that's the good point. So I do like that. I would also, just politically speaking, introduce a couple of tax settings, so to speak, that are clearly favoring renters and young people in an honest way. So I want us to move away from these pretend policies that people are actually now seeing through. This is the first home buyer grants. This is super for housing. I have zero respect for any politician who pushes things like this forward anymore. They have the backing of exactly zero economists. This is just some cheap narrative that they're pushing because it kind of sounds good, and if you don't think about it for more than 10 seconds, it does make sense. But any detailed scrutiny, it does not withstand. So that's annoying, and they're actually undermining their own political grounding. And believe it or not, I do want an Australia where the two major parties are strong. I do think that political stability is favorable over a splintered political system, because I don't think if you take this to an extreme, imagine a Australian parliament where every single MP would be an independent. That's perfectly thinkable, but how easy would it be to get policy through in this environment? So it'd be very hard, impossible, so to speak. So therefore, I would say it's helpful to have major parties that have the interest not just of the biggest voter bloc, but also of sizable minorities. And these would be renters, for example, in their best interest. So it's a delicate balancing act. And so far, I'm missing the honest political will to be talking about this, because they are super careful to not scare away the 3/4 of the votership that own a house in some way or form. And I think Australians are actually very capable of taking bad news, so to speak. And as long as they know that it is for the greater good. So hope is there that we'll get a more pragmatic approach to policy, but I'm not sure how big this hope is.
Well, thanks, Simon. So there are winners, there are losers, and they're going to continue on. We're going to be talking about these sort of trends each week in the Demographics Decoded podcast. It's not just property we talk about, but just general information that's going to shape your future. So if you don't currently subscribe to this show, just stop for a second and subscribe on whatever podcast app you're listening to. And again, as I said a bit earlier on, do us a favour and tell somebody else about the show. Somebody probably told you about it, and that's the way we can keep passing this information on to as many people as possible. On the other hand, if you'd actually like to get the information from Simon personally for your organisation, your company, your institution, Simon spends all his days speaking to government bodies, institutions, companies, organisations. I'll leave a link to the Demographics Group, your organisation, in the show notes, Simon, because I know that you tailor your presentations for your clients' needs.
Always. That's the whole fun thing about demographics, is that you can pull data for any particular industry, region. It's really easy to figure out what all of this means for particular client groups, and that's where the real fun begins, the real deep dive.
Well, I look forward to catching up with you again next week, Simon, and I'd like to talk to you about a ticking time bomb that's occurring in Australia, our ageing population. I know you've written about that in The Australian, so you write regularly in The Australian. That's behind a paywall, and the new daily where people can get your information every week as well. So let's discuss what this ticking time bomb could do, and maybe we'll see if we can diffuse it. Look forward to catching up with you next week, Simon.
Fantastic. I'll catch you next week.
This Demographics Decoded podcast has been brought to you by Metropole Property Strategists. We provide a complete range of services to help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you're looking to buy an investment property or your next home, why not have a discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists? Just go to metropole.com.au and explore your options. You'll find we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We provide a complete range of services, including property advisory, wealth advisory, home buying, buyer's agency, property management, renovations, and development management services. The team at Metropole will help you with frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades and we've been helping clients with for well over 25 years. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. In between these Demographics Decoded shows, you can follow me on social media, and I suggest you also follow Simon Kuestenmacher. You'll find him regularly posting on all social media platforms. And thanks for spending the last little while with Simon and me. I hope you got some benefit from the show. And if you did, and you know somebody who may also benefit, please tell them about Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you're definitely going to be doing us a favour, helping us in our quest to make as many people as possible aware of the demographic changes that are going to be shaping their future. And of course, if you don't currently subscribe, we'd love you to. And of course, any of the information that we've been sharing with you is general information because we don't know your specific circumstances.